moderator for last year. It's my pleasure to introduce our third Research Blitz, focusing on the social science and the humanities. This is, of course, where Penn's work in India maybe has its deepest roots, and so I'm looking forward to hearing from the discussants here this afternoon. I would encourage you to keep top of mind the same question that I put to the last panel around sort of what comes next. How would you take your research and kind of take it to another level? What becomes transformative for you in your fields, particularly thinking beyond your disciplinary boundaries? It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Lysette, who's going to moderate this panel and who is not so new anymore here at Penn. He's been around for a couple of years now. We're thrilled to have him, and he's the director of the South Asia Center. Mark.
Thank you very much, Amy. Let me add my welcome to Research Blitz 3, Social Sciences and Humanities. Each one of the presenters will have 5 minutes and 3 slides, and it will all go very quickly, but then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers following all of the presentations. Our first presentation is by Raj Patel, and it's entitled Trendsetters and Social Influence in the Swachh Bharat Mission. Okay. Yeah, please.
Hi. Okay. Sometime over the summer, in August, I took a flight from Delhi to Mumbai. I got in about 7 a.m. and I drove to Juhu Beach and I went to Akshay Kumar's house, the actor, and I talked to him for about an hour. A couple of weeks later, I took a similar sort of flight. It wasn't quite as early, and I went to Amitabh Bachchan's house, Janak, and I talked to him for about an hour. And I'm not gonna lie, I used to dream about these moments when I was younger. I used to play over and over again in my head what I would say, how cool it would be, what films we talk about. But actually what happened when I met them is that I just talked about toilets. I talked about toilets for about 90% of the time, a good 90%, it was just toilets. And so that was obviously, didn't live up to what I thought it was gonna be like, but it was still very cool. And so you might be wondering, well, why was I talking to these two about toilets? And you would be forgiven for thinking that I'm just a cool socialite who happens to have this odd interest in latrine use. But that's wrong. I was actually there as part of a Penn research team from the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, led by Dr. Christina Bicchieri. And we were there to investigate the role of certain individuals in the growth of this program, Swachh Bharat, which means Clean India, which is aimed at curbing the lack of toilet use, so open defecation. As you know, open defecation, or as you might know, open defecation is a big problem in India. Around some 500 million Indians in 2015 were practicing open defecation, and with some pretty dire consequences. There's a big public health crisis. Basically, that results from the kind of diseases that come from preventable diseases that come from contaminated water and so on. And so this Swachh Bharat was an incredibly ambitious program aimed to get India open defecation free by this year. So why are trendsetters so important here? And so what's important to know about problems like open defecation practices that might be interdependent is that they're not just driven by a lack of the right sort of technology. So the people aren't using toilets because they don't have them. You can build toilets and they still won't use them. There's something behavioral going on. So what you need is a policy that is aimed at behavioral change. And that's why some people refer to Swachh Bharat as the biggest attempt at behavioral change in history. And behavior change is often difficult because it requires people to move first. There's a deviation. I mean, sorry, when the practice is well entrenched, there's a cost to acting in ways that aren't in accordance with what everyone else is doing. And in that sense, well, entrenched practices like this have this kind of collective action phenomena. But it's precisely some individuals, those are the ones who kind of break away and they move first, away from the well-established practices, and they're willing to publicly deviate from standard practices in order to influence others. And those are the people who are key to changing behavior. And we call them trendsetters, and that's what we were there in India for, to investigate the role of trendsetters. And so through this semi-structured qualitative study, we selected individuals with a range of decision-making power, degrees of influence networks, and involvement in Swachh Bharat. And we wanted to know if trendsetters exhibit particular psychological traits, or they do well under particular sort of institutional environments. And we interviewed a wide range of people, from people on the ground to government officials to the Bollywood stars I was just talking about. And so what are they really like? Like, what did we find? Well, we found that they tend to have high risk tolerance, and they have a high level of perceived self-efficacy, which is the confidence that one has in one's capacity to engage in actions and produce intended outcomes. They're also willing to go their own way if they believe they have good reasons to do so. We also found that many of the people we interviewed were keenly aware of institutional challenges that come with such a big program, and the need, especially in a place like India with so many moving parts, to put it mildly, for cooperation and coordination. And so the people that we interviewed were actively involved in closing information gaps between institutions and facilitating communication between key players. And they also conscientiously tried to influence others. And it's precisely that kind of behavior that led to a cascade of influence that got Swachh Bharat moving in the right direction very, very quickly. And so I'll just end really quickly. What can we learn from this kind of behavior? So we think that you can learn quite a lot from trendsetters, especially when it comes to these kinds of collective action phenomena. Whenever deviating from an established practice is costly, you should try and find people who are willing to take on that cost. And trendsetters are key because they are willing to take on that initial cost. And so an organization that wants to encourage this kind of behavioral change should empower first movers with the psychological traits described, so low risk aversion, high autonomy, and give them flexibility as well. And they should empower those people who are explicitly passionate about the new behavior and have a history of willingness to take risks. Thank you.
Thanks. Our next presentation is by Kathleen Morrison, and it's entitled Biological and Cultural Diversity of South Indian Landscapes.
Oh, it just magically appeared. So many thanks, and many thanks to the India Research and Engagement Fund, especially for the outreach and capacity building part of this project. It's a part of a research project that I'm doing with with our moderator, and it's been going on for a long time. But let me just get started then. So I think most people know about the notion of biodiversity hotspots. But what many people may not realize is that the concept of the biodiversity hotspot has a very specific meaning. In order to be a biodiversity hotspot, a region needs to have 1,500 species or more of endemic vascular plants, according to the definition proposed by the NGO Conservation International, but also to have lost 70% or more of the original habitat. So what we see that in the notion of the biodiversity hotspot, that the idea of loss and especially risk is already baked into the definition right from the beginning. And what we might ask ourselves is, from a kind of historical perspective, is what do you mean exactly by original habitat? What could that really be? What is the original habitat? So what we see is that notions like the hotspot and other kinds of measures that are used in conservation and in policy really are built around the idea that humans are an intrinsic threat to nature, not a part of nature, that they are somehow by their very being constitute a threat. And what we often see in conservation and development circles is the notion that there's a kind of paradox that biodiversity hotspots, and you can see the Indian and Sri Lankan biodiversity hotspot here, but they're all around the world, of course, is that very often biodiversity hotspots are places that have high density of human occupation, and that's seen as somehow strange and confusing. But that kind of perception has real consequences for people living on the ground. So there's a well-known case that's going on right now, for example, a court case that's, there's been a stay, but in which millions of indigenous forest dwellers are facing eviction from their traditional homes in the forest in the name of conservation and especially biodiversity conservation. So these kinds of understandings that have an idea about past conditions are very much real and significant for the world today. But when we look at the long-term history of biodiversity in a place like India, what we find is hardly any data. Right? Most studies of biodiversity are very short-term, less than 100 years. And so our project really is an empirical project, that it's an evaluation of the actual long-term historical patterns of human land use and their consequences for biodiversity over about the last 5,000 years. So we're asking, what are the relationships between human land use practices and biodiversity, things like agriculture, livestock grazing, landscape scale burning, and just human settlement, and asking what kinds of practices lead to irreversible change, which kinds of practices lead to loss, but also which kinds of practices have historically maintained and even enhanced biodiversity. So we're working in 2 different regions. In southern India, you can see on the map there, one in the semi-arid part of North Karnataka, and the second in a semi-tropical part of northern Tamil Nadu. And what we find, just this is my last slide, is that really there is no paradox, right? The paradox of human occupation and high biodiversity is easily explained by understanding some of the long-term consequences of human land use in specific contexts. So this is very similar to what a lot of contemporary ecologists are finding, that some kinds of forms of, especially traditional, sort of small-scale land use are actually enhanced biodiversity. So the argument that people should be kicked out of their homes in order to protect biodiversity not only has sort of human rights consequences, but also, I mean, is not actually going to work. So our methods, it's a multi-disciplinary study in those 2 locations, one where we've worked for many years and one where we're only just started to work in the last couple of years. We're combining analytical methods from archaeology, from history, and from paleoecology. That's actually me down in the bottom of a trench there, collecting pollen samples in order to reconstruct vegetation history over the long term. So we're reconstructing past vegetation and human land use and looking at the kinds of engagements. So what do we do with all of this information? As part of our project, we're also working with colleagues, for example, the very important organization ATRI, the Ashoka Trust for Research and Education, Research and Ecology and the Environment, right? Who are engaged on the ground with the kinds of conservation issues and struggles that I alluded to. We're also working on a lot of capacity building, training workshops, training students and colleagues in some of the kinds of methods that we're using with colleagues from ATRI, the Indian Institute of Science, and others. Yes, I think I'm out of time.
You're out of time. Yeah. Thank you. Our next presentation is by Nikhil Anand and Anu Mathur, and it's entitled The Inhabited Sea.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. And thanks so much to Penn Global, to Amy and Allison for bringing us all together here today. I'm going to be talking about this project that I've been doing with Professor Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna. And much of this work, titled Inhabited Sea, much of this work is actually inspired by their book that they published in 2008 titled Soak, that compelled and called for the city of Mumbai to rethink its relationship with wetness, with the rains, the seas, the creeks, and the wetlands that actually constitute the material terrain of the city. Unfortunately, much of the city has not listened. The floods have not gone away. And so we returned to this project 10 years hence to ask how might we rethink the city in the time in between as a wet, muddy terrain, one that is made not just of land, but also of water. This is a very important time, needless to say, to be thinking about the city in the sea. Floods are now commonplace in Mumbai. There have been several this year. They were always an exceptional event every year in Mumbai, but their intensity and their frequency is increasing. There are these new events when garbage that lives in the sea now is being returned to the city with alarming regularity every year. The picture you see on the top right-hand side is of person walking along the waterfront on Marine Drive in Mumbai, now being inundated not just by the sea, which was fun for us as kids, but also by filth and garbage. And finally, Mumbai's future is actually in question with sea level rise. It is now it now regularly populates what I like to call the endangered cities list. So we want to return to these questions of thinking with wetness in a terrain that is always very wet and now even more so. But we want to think about urban and social processes not from land, but to reverse the view, to think in and from the sea with which the city is made. Much of our thinking around questions of climate, questions of water, questions of sea and river have always been from a terrestrial or a grounded perspective, seeking to make land dry because it is so much more lucrative to do so. I'm thinking of real estate markets, for example. But we want to reverse the view. And this reversal is actually, and muddy the view, to look from both sides, as it were, because much of Mumbai today is or was periodically sea. Much of it has been built from and with the sea. So how might we see a different city from that starting point of muddiness and wetness? We've started transdisciplinary research, and so we wanted to start the project from that conversation that we had with planners, architects, scientists, social scientists, and artists, to not give them projects to do wetness in their discipline, but actually to start with conversations about what this could actually mean across different disciplines. So we had an inception workshop in January where we worked through these themes, from which a series of 8-year-long projects have since commenced. This is the list of projects. They're clustered around 3 different themes, and they're all conducted with some substantive, if not both, major participation by planners, artists, social scientists, living and working in Mumbai-based institutions. The first is a cluster of projects of thinking in and living with wetness. And here we're thinking not just of people that live along the coastline or people whose homes are regularly inundated by rain, as a project that the School of Environment and Architecture is working on, but also non-humans, right? How do flamingos, crabs, and coral live in an intertidal landscape? How do they carry salinity back and forth, as Riya Shah and Professor Nurata Mathur are working on in this moment? And recognition of those practices, we suggest, might give us a different way to think about living in and with the sea. The second cluster of projects is one that I'm participating in, but also Professor Lalita Kamath, who's incidentally going to be here next week, is working on with fishers. And what are fisher sensibilities around navigating and negotiating the sea, but also the homes which are oftentimes built alongside or on the coastline. So what are the sensibilities of space and time? What might we learn about these sensibilities of space and time in the sea for questions about living in a city made uncertain by climate change? And the last cluster of projects is being done by the scientists who want to write social biographies of materials they find in the sea. These are oils, these are plastics, but these are also heavy metals that they're going to be working with. What are the ways in which they're both made by humans, put into circulation in the sea, and where do they go? Where does that garbage live, for example, before it is returned to Mumbai during a high tide? So this is a collection of different projects that are trying to address the same question from different vantage points. We hope to have different kinds of research that is produced from these, and hopefully at this time next year, a studio where Penn students might have the opportunity to go to Mumbai and work with these materials to imagine and think what the city might be otherwise. We'll also have a website and other kinds of publications that come out of this project. Thank you.
Our next paper is by Sumitra Bandranathan, and it's entitled Women's Labor Force Participation in Urbanizing India.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Sumitra, and I'm a 4th-year PhD student in the Political Science Department. But today I'm here on behalf of and representing the Center for the Advanced Study of India at Penn, CASI. I'm a research assistant at CASI, and I've been affiliated with several of their past projects, and they've supported me over the course of my PhD. So I'm going to start very quickly by an overview of the projects that CASI has undertaken in 2019, and then zoom into one of them that I've been most involved with. So Cassie, to begin with, did a really large series of papers and panels on the 2019 Indian election and what it implied for several sectors of society. Those papers were workshopped at an event in Cassie and then in DC and are now in the process of being submitted to peer-reviewed journals. One of the second large projects that Cassie has been doing over the last couple of years that is still ongoing is this large-scale survey of 9,000 farm households in eastern states in India on agriculture market reform. And this is a part of a Melinda and Gates Foundation grant. And a third project, which is also still ongoing, is on female labor force participation in urbanizing India. This is a project that I've been associated with from the past 2 years, ever since we started writing questions for the survey instrument, to now when data is being cleaned, and I finally have some raw analyses, which I'm going to slowly present today. So the project is based off of a Ford Foundation grant that looks at 14,000 households across 4 cities in India. Those cities are Patna, Varanasi, Dhanbad, and Indore. And the goal is to try to understand why female labor force participation in India is dropping. Today, I'm only going to show you some results from data from 3,500 households in one of those 4 cities in Patna. So to give you some background, India's per capita GDP is rising. Female fertility and infanticide and all of the bad outcomes that we would associate are declining. So given this, we should expect, traditional economic theory expects that female labor force participation should also rise in India. But the data basically shows an opposite pattern. We're seeing that labor force participation for women dropped from 35% in 1990 to 27% as recent as 2014, and the number is still falling. This is unlike other countries in South Asia and neighbors and other economies that have similar characteristics. And currently, India ranks 121 out of 131 countries in female labor force participation rates, and the gender gap between men and women in terms of labor force participation is increasing. So this is a puzzle because these results shouldn't present themselves as such. So in this project, our goal is to understand why this is happening. Several reasons could be presented as to why. So one of the things that we do in this project is undertake a large-scale experiment to understand which of these reasons is more or less important. So in the second panel on this slide, I have 3 of these reasons listed down. There could be an income shock if the primary wage earner in your family suddenly loses his or her job, or you lose that source of income. You might be inclined to start working as a woman who's previously been unemployed. Second, you might not work because you have family duties at home, but if someone comes in to relieve you of those duties, that might prompt you to work. And third, you might have a job that's actually available to you, that's very close to your home, that might prompt you to go out of the house. So which of these 3 reasons is it? Economic theory posits that it's the first one, that income shocks matter the most for female labor force participation increases. We test whether this is true in our study. How do we do this? We basically present different scenarios to unemployed women in our sample that adjudicate between these 3 factors. So on the left panel in this slide, I'm giving you 2 examples of such scenarios. For instance, the primary wage earner could have lost their job. The woman at home could have help to relieve her from her duties, and there is a new job close to home. Under these situations, we ask our unemployed respondents, would you work? Or another example is the primary wage earner has lost their job, no help is at home, and the desired job is 1 hour away. Under these conditions now, would you work? So this gives us a set of about 8 or so situations which we randomize our respondents into one of these 8 conditions and ask them whether under the given set of conditions they would like to work. And our results are pretty striking, as shown by this bar graph here. We see that having a job, a suitable job that's an hour away is significantly less likely to prompt unemployed women to work. And the magnitude of these effects is much larger than income or any other factor that the literature has previously shown to work in India. So in conclusion, because I know the minute sign went up, I'll say that we've assumed always that income has been a primary factor in India. We don't find that to be true from this small experiment. We find that women are actually willing to work. Their husbands are supportive of them doing this kind of work, but our results might suggest that infrastructure is lacking, safe mobility is lacking, and hence distance plays an important factor. And the policy implication for this would be that it's cities that are less hospitable towards women working, and that if we had to do something about this problem, we don't only need to improve gender norms or decrease the income effect, but we need to make cities more hospitable to women. And on that note, I'll end, but happy to take questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Our next paper is by Nicole Karapaniotis, and it's entitled Packaging Hinduism for Global Consumption.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to start off by thanking you for having me. I'm actually an assistant professor at Rutgers University in Camden across the river, so I'm happy to be presenting my work with you. My work is in the field of South Asia, primarily Hinduism. I'm a religious studies faculty member, and I look at the ways that religious traditions reinvent themselves in order to make their traditions go global, so to speak. So how religions rebrand to get more converts, and also how religious traditions use branding and marketing in order to recover from controversies. So today I'm going to be talking about one particular group that's a Hindu group. It's called the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. It's a Vaishnava religious movement, which means that it's centered on the worship of Vishnu or Krishna. And it's predominantly started in West Bengal, but it's since traveled around the world. So I'll just start with some images here. If you look up at the screen, I have a sort of clip of ISKCON's digital marketing and what ISKCON has historically looked like inside religious spaces. And so you can see on the left-hand side that the digital marketing has predominantly focused on images or forms of the divine personality of Krishna. So this is called a murti. And usually websites, social media sites will advertise temples and different traditions by use of Krishna's images. And you can see that these images and forms are also play a central role within the temple. And so you can see that at the front of the temple, there's an altar with these embodied forms of Krishna. There's a woman doing a prostration before these forms, and there's a ritual known as puja, where people will light incense, offer flowers, etc., to the gods themselves on the altar. So what I've been looking at in the focus of my book project is the ways in which this religious tradition's marketing is changing as devotees in the movement are trying to attract more global converts. And so I have two different images of what I'm calling rebranded ISKCON. And this is actually a center that's located here in Philadelphia in Fishtown. But these new rebranded centers are actually all around the world. And so if you look at the digital marketing image on the left of this particular rebranded center, there's a woman who's doing postural yoga, and the banner kind of rotates various pictures. Sometimes there's somebody meditating, various images that are meant to be evocative of mindfulness, etc. And the interior of the space has also been largely rebranded. And so the idea is to make it look as little like a temple as possible. And so there's no altar to speak of whatsoever. There are no embodied forms present in the space. There's a sort of animated drawing of Krishna on the wall. And there's just a series of couches and carpets on the floor. They're all, from the IKEA in Philadelphia near Penn's Landing. And the couches can be moved for a yoga class or a different kind of conversation. And so the work that I do really kind of looks at how this particular tradition, but then how Hindu traditions more broadly change their marketing in order to attract a global base of converts. I know there's way too much text on this slide, so I'm just going to summarize it. So essentially, some of the trends that we see is that when religions aim to go global, they tend to downplay the ritual traditions in favor of actions that are labeled as kind of spiritual actions, so to speak. And so practices like puja are downplayed. Worship of embodied forms of God tend to be minimized in favor of other kinds of practices, so practices like yoga, practices like meditation. So either the rituals themselves are just removed from the new space and from the new website, or they're recoded. And so an example of this within the ISKCON tradition, there's a practice called kirtan, which is essentially singing, a sort of singing prayer to the god Krishna. When this tradition aims to go global or to try to attract people outside of India, they'll code this ritual practice as musical meditation. And so there's different ways that they're downplaying ritual and overt ties to Hindu theology in favor of sort of more universalistic languages. And I want to suggest that this is something that occurs, this is a trend that we see not just within Hinduism, but also within other religious traditions. And so many of you are probably aware of the mindfulness movement in the United States and the prominence that it's come to in recent years. And the mindfulness movement has been similarly extracted from Buddhism. And the mindfulness has had to be divorced from Buddhist history, Buddhist theology, and Buddhist ritual in order to be able to be appropriated by a global audience. And we see the same sort of thing within Christianity as well. So I'll just use the example of Joel Osteen, who's this immensely popular preacher. And he's popular for many reasons. One of them is because he doesn't really mention Christian theology very much at all, so you won't hear him talking about hell. He very seldom will even bring up Jesus. There's no communion in his church, but he instead codes it in this sort of universal language of hope, etc. And so this is the global trend in religions. I think I'm out of time, so thank you.
Our final paper in this session is by Xingyi Wang, and it's entitled International Migration from India.
Great, thank you very much. I'm an associate professor at the Wharton School, and I want to thank the organizers for putting this conference together and inviting me to talk today about international migration from India. So India is a top provider of international migrants. If you look at data from 2015, you will see that over 15 million people who were born in India are residing in other countries. Another interesting fact about international migration from India is that international migrants are very geographically concentrated. Okay, so more than half of these migrants who leave India for other countries reside in one of just 3 countries. And those 3 countries are the United Arab Emirates, which is in the Gulf, the United States, and Pakistan. And my research in particular focuses on this very important migration corridor between India and the United Arab Emirates. So as this figure shows, what millions of people in India are doing is that they are making an active choice to leave India to go to another country. Okay, and in economics, you know, we want to learn something oftentimes about people's preferences, and it's hard to observe people's preferences. And so what we do instead is we make inferences about people's preferences based on observations that we can make about the actual choices that they make. Okay, so under this kind of approach, which we call in economics the revealed preference approach, we might say that people in India must be better off when they migrate because millions of them are making that active choice to do so, right? That by making that choice, they are saying that it is better for them to live and work in another country, at least for some period of time, and that it's going to give them work opportunities or other opportunities that they would not otherwise have, and that would make their own lives or their family lives better off. Okay. Well, now let me just show you some headlines that I pulled from a number of different newspapers. These are all Western newspapers that are well known. And these are headlines that are covering stories about international workers who are working either in the United Arab Emirates or in other Gulf cooperation countries who have similar systems of guest worker programs. Okay? And you can see from these headlines that the picture that they paint from these media reports are very different than a story of people, you know, making an active choice and making their lives better through international migration. So they're highlighting stories about, you know, people who are being beaten by the police because they engaged in labor strikes. You know, they're suffering from life-threatening heat and bad work conditions. People are committing suicide. There's slave labor. So overall, the picture that is being painted by these headlines is not pretty, and it's suggesting that perhaps people are not improving their lives by making the choice to migrate, and in fact, they may often regret their decisions and go to extreme outcomes, including committing suicide. And so how do we go about reconciling these 2 pictures of international migration from India? So what I aim to do in my research agenda is try to answer that exact question. And in particular, we want to be, you know, very careful in terms of using data to estimate carefully the costs and benefits of migration from India to the United Arab Emirates. So how do I do that? So my team and I, we have partnered with the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Labor and with several large construction firms who operate in the UAE, but who go to India in order to hire construction workers. And so what happens with these construction workers is that they usually, you know, they go to India, they screen workers, and then they ask the Ministry of Labor for visas for these workers to come to the UAE to work. Okay, and the Ministry of Labor decides how many visas to give them. And oftentimes they give them less visa slots than they ask for. And so this is where, we come in and we say what we can do is we can work with the Ministry of Labor in order to randomize among a pool of people who the firms have screened as qualified for these jobs, who is actually going to get the visa and therefore the job offer, and who is not going to get the visa and the job offer. Okay, and so it's something that is similar to, a system that you might be more familiar with in the United States called the H-1B visa system, where people have to enter a lottery in order to get a visa. Okay, but one important difference in this context is that we're talking about much lower skilled workers. And so then what we can do after we have this randomization of people who get a job offer and a visa and people who don't, is that we can follow both of these groups of people and be able to estimate, what does it mean to get a job offer in the UA. But just to be extremely clear, not everyone in our treatment group, not everyone who gets the job offer and the visa chooses to take it. Some of them, even though they have the job offer, they choose to stay in India or to go somewhere else. And those people who are in our control group, and by that I mean the people who don't get the visa and the job offer from our partner firm, they are free to apply for other jobs, including other jobs in the UAE. So it's not like we're saying that you can't work in the UAE at all. You just are not going to get this one specific job offer from our partner firm. Okay, but so then what we can do is we can compare these two groups of people and try to get a comprehensive measure of well-being. Okay, so we can ask questions like, how does migration change income? And one of the things that none of us might find surprising is the fact that moving to the UAE is going to increase how much these people earn by a great deal. But then what are the potential costs of that? And so we can ask questions about their subjective well-being, including questions about loneliness. We can ask about debt to think about what kind of labor intermediary fees do you have to pay in order to get access to this job. We can ask questions about work conditions to think about whether or not that there are different work amenities between India and the UAE. And so I think I'm out of time, but I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you. This is an incredibly rich and interesting set of papers and really, really diverse, right? So I want to start by asking a question that everyone might be able to answer. And I want to do that by asking about collaboration, and collaboration in two ways. On the one hand, all of us have collaborators in India. We all work with institutional and individual collaborators, some of whom we've worked with for many, many years, some of whom are new collaborators, perhaps, in these projects. And the other element of that I'm interested in, though, has to do with Penn, right? And how it is that Penn's South Asia programs help foster collaborations or provide opportunities, or how they might do that better. Penn is an extraordinarily rich resource in terms of South Asia. We have an academic department. We have 2 centers on campus, 1 center located in Delhi. By my count, just looking through the program, there are 9 schools represented on this program, 2 centers, right, and including researchers from the South Asia Center's affiliate program who participate in the community of the university even though they're located outside of it. Right? There is, as we've seen, there's substantial support for research in South Asia from the university, especially at the provostial level. Right? So how does Penn help us do this? And how might we do this better? And we can just sort of pass it down the row, and anyone can start. Just everyone should have a chance to speak.
Check, check.
Okay, So I think that, you know, the resources at Penn for research in India are incredible, and they have been extremely helpful for my own research. You know, I've been extremely grateful to receive funding for the project that I discussed with you from Penn Global, and that's been really important. But I do also think that, you know, beyond the funding, there are incredible other resources at Penn, including all of the centers that you have discussed. And so it's one of the things that going forward in a lot of my research that I hope to take advantage of more. But I think that, you know, speaking to your first question about, you know, the collaborations with organizations on the ground, I mean, I think that you're right that it is extremely important. I mean, one of the things that I want to do is I want to acknowledge a lot of help that we got from IFMR in India, which some of you may have worked with as well. So they were really instrumental in terms of, you know, the large-scale data collection that we are undertaking for this, where we're following, you know, something like 5,000 people who started out in India, but these are an extremely mobile population who are, you know, trying to move to countries across the world. You know, they have been extremely instrumental in helping us, you know, run around the country of India to find these people's households in order to track them down so that we can make a call to them in Malaysia or wherever they are, so that we can find out, you know, what actually happened to them after they got the job offer or did not get the job offer.
That's a great question. And as the only person who's not at Penn here, I'm probably the least qualified to answer this. But for me, you know, having the South Asia Center at Penn has been really great. So I work across the river at Rutgers Camden, and just having another university and other conversation partners not too far away has been great. Just getting invited to speak here and coming to hear different lecture series at Penn. So I guess more of that, there's so many universities in the Philadelphia area, we sometimes become siloed. So I think just, you know, more cross-campus collaboration would be great. And for myself, I'm an ethnographer, so my collaborators are, you know, the very research that I do. And so people have just been really generous in my own work, my book project on this, just welcoming me not only to their religious centers, but to their homes, to different areas of their lives to talk about what are some pretty challenging questions that I think I've had to ask a lot of the people that I work with. And so that's been just great for me, so.
So I'm actually currently in the process of doing exactly what you were asking about, because I'm writing up the data part of my dissertation, and I have to cobble together funds from various sources to make the projects that I want happen. So in order to provide an answer to your question of how we could do this better, one thing that I've noticed is that the largest awards and grants available on campus are for faculty only or faculty-student collaborations. And if a student or student co-authored work needs funding, these are basically inaccessible. I think the largest funding source that students alone can get on campus is from GAPSA, and that's 6,000. And if you're doing a project in India and have two authors, that's basically one round-trip flight ticket for everybody and no costs at all for the project. So maybe one thing we could do is open up larger scale funding for students alone. I see I have some support in the crowd over here for that, because we do projects that are pretty large scale and that require a lot more than $6,000. I just finished a large scale field intervention on teaching people media literacy tools to reduce fake news consumption, and it took me over a year just to gather the funding from various sources for it, because the 6,000 would go almost nowhere in getting me there. So that's my 2 cents on it.
You know, I'm from the School of Design, and we collaborate maybe in a slightly different way than most of my colleagues here. In some ways, we are collaborating with the places and people we work and sort of design or think about. But being at Penn for many years now, I found that except for Cassie, there was very little happening in which we could actually relate and work on India or get supported. Even that was not much support. So I would say that this initiative is, in my view, the first that is actually giving substantive support in terms of, you know, working this way. And it's an interesting challenge because as designers, you know, yes, I work with my partner, I work with my students, but we don't collaborate that much, you know. I mean, others may do. So it's in some ways opened us, you know, especially the project that Nikhil, you know, that I'm collaborating with Nikhil, it kind of opened us to finding other ways, you know, to work what we do. But I think what has been very critical in our collaboration, and we kind of agreed about it from the beginning, was that it's not about just bringing disciplines together and working in a transdisciplinary way, that we all still work with our methodologies and silos, that how do we affect certain ideas from the beginning? So how do designers affect the way scientists work? How do anthropologists affect the way designers work? And so we, from the very beginning, set up that we will have a kind of workshop or a way of convening that starts that dialogue on some of these ideas that I think that Nikhil talked about, that we were trying to get away from these sort of oppositions of land and water. The sea is out there, the land is here, the city is here, the sea is there, and how people live from the beginning. So challenge the scientists who might be siloed, challenge the designers. So in some ways we called it transdisciplinary, that we wanted to start on that kind of collaboration. And I think we've sort of, in some ways, infected that, I would say. But I'll let Nikhil answer more here.
Thanks, Mark, for that question. I think one of the things that good collaboration calls for, requires, is a conversation between collaborators to even define what the research questions are, right? And what's been really nice about having the chance to work on this project with Anu, but also with Penn Global, is having the space to actually have our collaborators in India determine what the projects are, what the interventions might be, before they are handed out, or not that they should be handed out, right? So I think that's a very important mode of collaboration, and so therefore to have the institutional support for things to be experimented on, things to be slow, things to go awry, is very important to collaborative work. It's much harder than just working by ourselves, I think. So it's been nice to have the freedom to do that with this project, and that the project collaborators get equal opportunity to define what these interventions are or might be. I think I really appreciate the point that was made earlier about support for student-driven, ambitious projects. I think you really do see the initiative, the Penn Global initiative, making those initiatives available for faculty, but it'd be nice to think about other ways for students to also push projects forward, because you actually see a lot of creativity and innovation from academics at all levels. It's not just students alone. So I'll stop there.
Just want to start out with a shout out to UPSC, who is, which I think, an amazing resource that Penn has. As someone who's a relatively newish faculty member here, having the UPSC based in Delhi really facilitated some of the research work that we've done, even that not linked to this particular project. So I think that that's a terrific resource. And I'm also very enthusiastic about the South Asia centers and Penn Global, both a role in bringing together, as several people have already said, kind of cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary groups, including our colleagues who know much about South Asia and work in South Asia from other universities in the neighborhood. So I think that's terrific. For my part, I'm also hoping, I'm also a curator at the University Museum, a curator for Asia at the Penn Museum, and I think that we could do a lot better at the museum in engaging with South Asia. We actually have no South Asian objects on display yet, but we will. And we are doing work with teacher groups and various other kinds of training and outreach things, but that's something that we would like to do, and I would like us to build more museum-to-museum relationships with Indian museums. One area I think that we could really improve is getting students abroad. The students at all levels, doctoral students, less so in a sense, because they can get grant research money. Penn is great at supporting undergraduate research. They have tons of money for that, and that's marvelous. But as far as sort of study abroad classes and options, it's really actually relatively limited, and I think it's a life-transforming experience often for students to go abroad, and I hope that we can do more of that.
Hi, so I'm a PhD student, a PhD candidate as well, so I second the kind of call for more money for us. I'm, in another sense though, I'm quite lucky. I'm spoiled in the sense that I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy, but the sort of work that I've done, I've always been interested in PPE type work, philosophy, politics, and economics, and I just happen to be a part of this new center that's starting up, which is the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. and I'm lucky enough to just work with economists and political scientists on stuff that I'm interested in. But what's interesting about that is that it's not really collaboration between departments, it's just individuals who happen to be interested in a narrow set of topics in PPE. So there might be some more room for collaboration there.
Okay, thanks. Let me open it up to the floor. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. Do we need to? There's one going around down there.
Hi. I'm interested with a women's labor force study. And I guess like this question also could be applicable to the other studies, but like specifically, how do you think increasing labor force, women's participation in the labor force impact other sectors? Like for example, primary school access. And I guess like for the other researchers, how do you think, or what are the risks, the possible risks that you engage in by doing a specific study in a certain space?
Okay, so to answer your first question, there is already evidence that labor force participation or beneficial outcomes for women impact other things like health outcomes and school outcomes. They're not causal studies, but correlationally we can see that people who are already engaged have better outcomes in terms of health. So it's not a perfect answer in that sense, but it gives us some sort of motivation that actually increasing it is not only good for the economy in a macro sense, but also in a micro sense for their personal outcomes. To answer your second point, it was really, really hard to do a study like this. What I presented today was a very small sliver of the survey instrument that had mostly a lot of sensitive questions, and I think more important ones on gender perceptions and norms, which we haven't yet analyzed because the data is still being cleaned. So we had a lot of questions directed personally to the women about, do you have money that you save from your husbands? And we consider a bunch of these questions to be, in some sense, an index of empowerment. We haven't looked at that yet, but in order to successfully ask those questions in a setting where we could make women feel safe enough to answer them was our biggest challenge. So what we did to try to overcome that was we sent always a team of 2 survey enumerators into each household, not just one, as has been done in the past. And the reason for this is we don't just require a woman to ask questions to a woman, we require a man to keep the men engaged while this is happening, because we found always that the men have, whether you like it or not, listened from behind closed doors. So we managed to do that for the most part with this survey. We have a question that asks, where enumerators have to note after the survey how successfully this was put into place. I think in cases as less as 10 or less out of a sample of about 14,000 where this didn't happen, and we haven't looked at that data yet, but it was hard. We still don't know how successful this was, but it was our small effort to try to get true answers on sensitive issues.
Would anyone else like to address that question? Okay, I think we have another question back here.
My question was to Patel. Was it normally known that human waste is actually an asset because you can produce gas, energy, and organic fertilizer from it? And so you should have a collection system as a norm? Was that normally known in the people you talk to?
Well, so we were just talking about, like we were trying to stop open defecation, so people going outside and it creating these kinds of externalities of kind of waterborne diseases. Now, we didn't, the question that you're asking, I don't think really came up in our interviews about whether yeah, I don't think it came up.
Can we get a microphone over here?
I could add something. Sure. Mark?
What?
I was just going to say
Go
that
ahead.
just historically, there's not really any tradition in India of using night soil for agricultural amendments. But animal manure, on the other hand, has a considerable and important kind of history there. So, I mean, it's interesting because it's a completely different trajectory than other parts of the world where human waste has been historically used in agriculture. That's really just not the case for what we understand archaeologically.
I don't think it's on.
This has been terrific, by the way. There we go. That's better. And we've talked a lot about women, about a third of the population. We've talked some about men. And we've talked almost not at all about the other third of the population, which is people under 18. There are a lot of people under 18 in India. At what point do we talk about that?
How would you address children, subadults in your research? No.
One of the projects that I put up that we're working on, the Monsoon and Lalubhai project by the Arts Collective Camp, is precisely working with, not children, but between 14 and 18, so yes, children, but older children, trying to talk about their experiences in and around wetness, to basically get that sensibility as, on and in our work as well. So they're very active. The kids have already started making and shooting video, and we hope to see what they see soon.
Anyone else want to? Yeah.
I would say one of our partners also on our project is the Sharma Center for Heritage Research, just based out of Chennai. And the Sharma Center is a kind of amazing organization. It's run by 2 archaeologists, and they do a lot of science education with rural kids and teachers on the outskirts of Chennai. So they both do scholarly research and a lot of kind of public outreach, and they even have a little museum that they do, which is really quite amazing, because science education, science museums, and things like that really not very well developed.
Let me just follow up with you, Sumitra, because one of the things that occurs to me about talking about children and talking about women's participation in the labor force is, what role does education have, right? Because that's the pipeline to the labor force, right? How do you see women's education as relating to your research topic?
So we started analyzing this data, and we do find that education has a moderation effect, in that women who are more educated are more likely to say that they will take up a job that is far away. So the distance tends to matter less when women are educated. But there's also something to be said about the fact that there's some underlying factor that we're not measuring that predicts both education and wanting to get a job outside the house. And that's the fundamental problem in doing studies that are mainly correlational in this nature. So I don't have a perfect answer, but we do have a vast range of questions measuring not just the education of the women at home, but also the education of the children in that household. And one question I think that we have might get closer to answering your question, which is we ask women and men, how far do you want your children who are currently in school to continue to study until? So this is looking into the future. And we're finding that women and men give different answers depending on the gender of their own child. So women and men both want their girl children to study less, but women more than the men, and the effect is the inverse for boy children under the age of 15 who are currently in school. So that's a kind of tangential finding, not fully related to labor force participation. It's something that we ask in the survey.
Okay, great. Anyone? Yeah.
Again, I'm not an economist, and when I hear women's work being called the labor force, it sometimes bothers me a little bit, because we've sort of turned this whole thing into a model in which we're imagining they go out somewhere to work, and that's the way we divide family life and work life. So in your study, what about women who work at home? Like, I don't mean housework. I mean, when you go into the places like Bengal or Sundarbans, a lot of the kantha work that happens comes from people who've been again, they choose their time of work, they fit, so it's a very different holistic way of thinking about their lives. So I'm wondering if that comes into equation?
That's about 80% of the study. What I presented today was the small 20% experimental work, where yes, the focus was on going outside the house to get work. But most of the other part of the study is just descriptive questions about understanding the different kinds of work that women do and providing them with a whole range of options to work inside the house. Some people assist from home in the family business, and we have that also. We ask about occupations or businesses that women run from inside the home and find that the most important one is tailoring and hairdressing businesses that they run from within their houses. So a large part of the survey is focused on asking that kind of questions. And the project involves a large range of authors. I'm only analyzing this small chunk of the data, so I haven't looked at that yet, but the focus was not on this experiment at all.
Yes.
I also had a question for you. I think it's very interesting that you've chosen to look at urban India when actually more women work in rural India, and labor force participation has also fallen in rural India. So why have you, chosen this, and just some...
So one of the reasons was that labor force participation has fallen across the board for India, not just for women, but also for men. But between the urban and the rural setting, the gap is pretty stark. For urban women, it has fallen to a much larger degree than for rural women. And that's why we chose to focus on urban cities. But even within the urban setting, we didn't want to focus on metro cities like Mumbai, where you might expect the ethos and the mindset of people who are either living there or have migrated there to be different. So our focus was on urbanizing tier 2 cities in India. So hence we chose Patna, Varanasi, Dhanbad, and Indore. And hopefully the goal in the future is to get funding to push this to the rural area also. So this is kind of like a first step in a much larger research agenda. I hope that answers your question.
Do you have a question?
So thank you for your question. I very much appreciate that. My engagement in India has been predominantly as an educator. And the concern that I hear over and over again is how much education is being shunted, because this is what parents are concerned about, namely into IT, technology, engineering, economics, with all the other aspects of society being almost made subordinate to that, or even not in the field of vision. And I consistently feel the anguish about how much education is being shunted into workforce activity as opposed to learning for life, learning for transformation, learning for how to be people, how to deal with nature, and so on. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that I think comes from what your comment is that I think the parental and global perspective about the value of education is undermining some of the deep, rich philosophical traditions that have existed in India for a very long time that the rest of the world needs to learn about, as opposed to us increasingly trying to influence India. My view is that we need India to influence the world much more than is actually happening. And I'd love to hear what your comments are about that thought.
Thank you for your comment, and it's something which I think about a lot, and I do talk about a lot, especially when we, talking about climate change, and there is a whole energy that somehow we don't know what we are doing here, but we're going to resolve it and take it to the, rest of the world, tell people in Bangladesh what to do, tell people in India what to do, and we constantly find that that we completely ignore, and we're not talking about, traditional practices, but a certain intelligence which was already in the environment with the way people dealt with things, is highly undervalued. So either it's put under cultural studies or traditional studies, and it's not part of a contemporary way of thinking. And in some ways, I feel that our project, Nikhil and I, which we are using the term wetness, which may not have made any sense to anybody in this short moment, is actually turning to that in some ways. And so, again, we're not itemizing the project that it's for women or men or designers or government. It's about trying to build a new sensibility, and a lot of it comes from a rereading of our own past and our history. And so we feel that definitely what we're doing is something that with other places in the world may want to look at, especially in this time where we are, sort of concerned about our environment. And it's a sort of a non-dualistic approach versus categorizing things. And we've taken that very well from the West, about we categorize everything. And so sometimes I also sort of shudder when I, think of things being broken up into parts and, women out or in or children. And I think there are attempts like that. So it's interesting to hear that from you.
Can we just add and wholeheartedly agree with what Anu is saying? I think one of the problems is that the everyday knowledges of living are oftentimes not characterized as expert knowledges. Instead, the subjects of that living are seen to lack an education through which we devalue all their ways of knowing, right? And so one of the impulses of this project is to draw attention to those sensibilities, call them expert sensibilities, and ask what can we in educational institutions learn from them, right? So I think very much allied with the kind of sentiment you expressed, to see what those practices might teach us in the university.
Anyone else want to address that? Okay, I think there are two kinds of issues here that are raised by your question. One is the structure of Indian educational systems, right? Particularly higher education and the kind of draw to the IIT programs and other kind of technical kinds of programs. And the way that's changed the structure of, say, the humanities, right? And the complexity and the emergent complexity in the Indian higher educational sector. That's certainly one element of what we could talk about. But I think the other thing is, right, how does knowledge from India come into our systems of knowledge? And I think for all of us, right, for all of the kind of projects we work on, it's all deeply collaborative. Without our Indian collaborators, we couldn't do anything at all. And it's not simply access or they're working on our kind of theoretical programs, but it's knowledge that's being generated in institutions in India by researchers and scientists and students that's crucially important to everything that we do here.
My thought on that, though, would be how much are Indians studying America?
How much what?
Are Indians studying America?
How much are they studying America?
How much do Indians study American traditions? When you think about collaboration, the research seems to me needs to go both ways. And this is not in any way to demean what we're doing. I think what we're doing is spectacular. But it'd be just wonderful if we had particularly Asians studying the West, using Asian principles for understanding the West, not just the one way. That was my thought about this.
Well, certainly it would be interesting if there were, say, American studies programs, right, in Indian universities, right? That's not something we can influence, but we do work very hard to bring students and bring collaborators here, right? To have programs like one that's sponsored by my center that brings researchers from South Asia here for specific kinds of training and methodological workshops and other kinds of programs, right? So there are ways in which we try to address this in the ways that we can, right? Yeah.
Just to add to that, one of the projects that I didn't mention here that we're working on with the Penn program in environmental humanities is a comparative project between Mumbai and Philadelphia. And it's precisely to ask, and we're bringing next week, Lalita is one of those people, scholars from India to think about the patterns and processes of distribution of water and its politics in Philadelphia, and what can we learn from that kind of engagement back and forth. I think you're absolutely right, because otherwise India appears as research site and Indian people as research subjects, but why can't we invert that and think of Indian experts, Indian scholars studying the peculiarities of our system here in the US, because it is also full of patronage relationships as we see the White House today. It is also full of discrete kinds of silences and accommodations that actually are key to the making of this polity. So I think that comparative and collaboration go both ways of what the subject is absolutely critical.
Any other questions? I think we're about out of time. So I'm going to thank the panelists, and I hope you'll join me in doing so.
So thank you, Mark. That was a great conversation, and I can't imagine a better dialogue and discussion around kind of knowledge exchange between the U.S. and India as a foundation for our next discussion, which is obviously a conversation with Ambassador Rich Verma about the U.S.-India relationship. So thank you for teeing that up so well. Thank you, Mark. Thank you to the panel. We will take a short 15-minute break while we readjust the stage and invite you back for a dialogue with Ambassador Verma. Thank you.
Yeah.